Thank you, Yvonne, and good afternoon, everyone. Given the climate urgency, it is no longer about asking if we can achieve a just transition for Southeast Asia. We need to achieve it. We need to peak our emissions earlier, and we need to lower the transition costs by creating quality green jobs. And today, we have our panel to tackle the key challenge of how we can accelerate the transition. So what are the roadblocks today, and what are the innovative financing solutions to help us unlock structural constraints, as well as to catalyze additional investments into this region? So to kickstart today's discussion, I'd like to first invite Cindy to help us set the context and the state of play for Southeast Asia. So Cindy, what are some of the key challenges and trade-offs, right, that we need to meet in order to meet both net zero ambitions while sustaining net zero or economic growth for the region?
If you look at Southeast Asia, it is a very diversified market because each member state in ASEAN are at different state of development, number one. And number two, they have very different market framework. Thirdly, the kind of industry and community in Southeast Asia in Southeast Asia country are also very different. And increasingly, there is aspiration and willingness to do a lot of downstreaming as they participate in the economic progress and to cater to the population, not just the growth, but the population's aspiration. If you look at the demographics in Southeast Asia, you see a lot of youth. And there is an ambition to look at not just projects that pays the returns, but also projects that have an impact on the environment, number one. And number two, longevity in terms of career and progress. So we really like to be a queen bee in Southeast Asia. When I say we, not just Keppel, but Singapore at large, because we see ourselves as a potential force multiplier. We can leverage not just technology, but also the state-of-the-art governance in terms of framework, integrity, financing, and more importantly also the supply of talent with win-win mentality. So this is where, since 3 years ago, we start to participate, not just focusing on renewable generation, which is the supply side, but truly playing the entire value chain to do something that's scalable from the infrastructure angle, which is matching diversified supply with diversified demand center, at the same time facilitating smooth transition without inevitably dislocating viable projects or dislocating workforce.
Thanks, Cindy. I think just building on that a bit, right? So we did talk about Southeast Asia as not being a homogeneous market, and each country has its own local dynamics and complexities. So how does Keppel navigate these dynamics, and what are some of the opportunities, right, that you see?
So very interestingly, I think the key is to find successful pathfinder project. Don't worry about how small it starts, but have the line of sight to what is the end ambition. So one classical example is truly the ASEAN power grid. So 2 years ago, we started pursuing bringing renewable electrons cross-border. So you imagine that in Europe or in Nordic countries, a unified and connected power grid is not uncommon. In fact, it is the norm. But if you look at the Southeast Asia, we don't have a unified power grid. And especially if you look at renewable, the opportunity is there because Southeast Asia, ASEAN member states have abundance of renewable. And it's so diversified. You have hydro potential in Laos, you have large solar potential in Indonesia, you have geothermal in Philippines. So if you zoom out the problem statement, the boundary become very solvable if you harness different sources of renewable so that you bring down the levelized costs of renewable and bring it to where you have the highest and best use. And when I say highest and best use, it is where the value of the electron is no more a commodity or utility. You serve high value added industries like advanced manufacturing, like data center, and proportionally you invest in the value chain to promote upskilling, to promote technology adoption. So this is where we managed to bring hydroelectric across Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, 100 megawatt. What people don't see is the complexity in navigating 4 different energy markets. You can imagine Laos have its own energy market and regulatory framework. So has Malaysia and Thailand and Singapore. So how to negotiate for that commercial power purchase agreement, how to have that operating protocol that's being agreed amongst 4 member states. What about the legal structure? What about the downside protection? The ability of Keppel being able to do it is because we are not just a pure financial investor. We have operating capability. We have been playing in the electricity market for more than 20 years. We know also what is the price of the off-taker for these renewable electron that is across the border. And more importantly is we focus on the win-win. So we proportionally decide what is the kind of willing charges to be shared amongst Malaysia, Thailand, and Laos, so that is fair and equitable. With this lesson learned, we managed to also secure the first conditional approval to bring large-scale renewable energy from Laos, Cambodia using subsea cable to Singapore. That's 1 gigawatt continuous power, which means you can scale up to about 3 gigawatt of renewable installation in Laos, Cambodia. By the same token, we are also part of the consortium to bring Indonesia renewable into Singapore. So this is exactly case in point. We start as Pathfinder project, but the ability to scale using the lessons learned is very important.
Thanks, Cindy. Actually, I wanted to say there's a lot of lessons that we can learn, because I want to park this question for later, but how can we replicate such a model to set up potentially a regional carbon trading market in Southeast Asia? And I'll turn to Mikkel for that later. But I think maybe I want to turn to Wee Sing for now. It's because I think there are a lot of opportunities, right, that Cindy had talked about. And in the recently launched Southeast Asia Green Economy Report, there is still a 1.5 trillion USD gap for infrastructure. So what can we do more, right, to catalyze the likes of Keppel and other investors to channel capital flows? Because clearly the demand is there, but why isn't investments happening?
Okay. I think those of us who predate this energy transition wave, you will remember already Asia always struggled with this Asia infrastructure gap. I think ADB always said there's 800 billion that we're short of. And now it's exacerbated by the fact that there's also a climate energy transition thing. So that's one thing. So the challenge has always been there, is alluding to something that Cindy said, for investors, right, capital across the capital stack, equity, debt, project financiers like myself, it's always about investable projects. The money is there, right? The money is there across. And it's no surprise that many of these, actually the number of players in the energy sector in particular have proliferated big time since the fossil fuel days, right? In the old days when we did project financing for a lot of these projects, it was the strategic players. It was the Japanese, the Koreans. Today you have infrastructure funds galore, right? So it's a lot there. But where's all the money going? OECD markets. Right, it's a lot of Taiwan offshore wind. The next big thing is Japan, Korea offshore wind. Australia gets a lot of it. So the challenge that Southeast Asia faces, and I'm hoping that Singapore would catalyze something big, is the lack of scale. Right, the challenge with renewables is it has gotten a lot smaller. In the good old days of fossil fuel, when you do a power plant, it's at least 660 megawatts. 300 megawatts is very small. Today, a solar 50 megawatts is utility scale, right? But that's $50 million. So I think the pathway and the pipeline of projects would attract the investments. And where Southeast Asia suffers a little bit is it's become smaller, and the pathway to a pipeline of projects that I can get a return on effort for, right? Because infrastructure projects, the rigor you put into due diligence over a 20-year period is very high. So return on effort is a very important thing. Of course, return on equity is important, but return on effort is important. And therefore, there's 4 gigawatts that Singapore wants to import. Now, 4 gigawatts is base load. Right? Now, you remember that solar, for example, if it's 4 gigawatts of solar base load, it has to be 20 gigawatts. It's a scale of 5. Right? So it has to have batteries and all that. So it'll be a very catalytic project where multiple ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Sarawak, Laos, Cambodia, multiple projects will sprout out with a very good off-taker, AAA Singapore, So this, hopefully, will finally catalyze this 20 or multi-decade dream of ASEAN power grid, right? Okay, of course, geopolitics is never easy, but I think if you get that scale up and people can see that, hey, it's doable, the money would flow, the investability would improve. The second thing is we're also seeing, especially in India, that although solar farms are big, people are realizing, hey, I only get it for 4 to 5 hours, right? Now I want round the clock. People are realizing that, hey, I need to stabilize the grid. I can't have you in and out every 5 hours. So I want hybrids. I want sun, I want wind, and I want batteries. So the increasing sophistication of these things hopefully will address the scale issue. And then when the scale issue is solved, then I think you would see that effort go in to making projects bankable in Vietnam, Indonesia, because they have done big scale projects before. It's just that unfortunately, because it's gotten so small, some of it has fallen away, the interest has gone away. Sorry for such a long
I think that's a very interesting point, because then I'll turn to Marat, right? Because that's the whole point. Pentagreen was set up as a joint venture between Temasek and HSBC to look at marginally bankable projects. And I think just to beyond the surface, right? We all know it is most difficult to make your first transaction, first deal, because I think it took about a year since Pentagreen was formed. So what were the challenges that you had to overcome to make this first transaction?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to first of all echo, I think Wee Seng and Sydney covered it very well. I think one of the key issues we face in this region, which is a consequence of all the diversity, the small scale, the innovation, the different types of business models that we now start to see across the various transition sectors, not just power, not just renewables, but also moving into energy efficiency, electric vehicles, all of these sort of things. The diversity and the lack of scale and the increasing complexity that you need results in ultimately extra risks, right? Elevated risks, because at each part of that chain, there is something new, unproven, untested, some new business model, some new type of off-taker, new type of off-take contract that you need to put together to make the actual project or situation even look like barely investable, right? So that adds its challenges, and therefore the traditional sources of finance and very commercial sources of finance look at this kind of picture and see this kind of risk-reward disconnect between what's actually there and what we're all in, especially in the traditional world, we're all used to in terms of the kind of risk-reward that we can find acceptable. We did our first transaction in the Philippines just last year, which showed quite a few of these features. It was a portfolio of solar plants by themselves as a technology, nothing too difficult, but each individual project relatively small, 50 megawatt or thereabouts, as Wee Seng was saying. So we thought, okay, why don't we pool these projects together to get scale? You pull them together, then you find a different problem. One project has this kind of off-taker, another project has a different kind of off-taker. I don't even know the credit rating of that off-taker. Oh, actually the off-take contract, the price varies. So how do I structure financing against this, and how do I even make sure that this financing looks like commercial type of financing, right? We got that transaction away, we got it done. We were the sole and the lead arranger and lender in that transaction. Of course, after we got it done, we started getting calls from the market asking us about it, how it's possible, can we come alongside? But when we were putting it together, we were the sole lead financial institution on that deal. And ultimately, our view, if we reflect on this, how to do this multiple times, because that was one deal, we see strong demand for these kinds of transactions out there in the market from other borrowers. But if we had to do it again and again and again, we need to scale a capital base that can take and deal with these kinds of risks. And this starts to take us down the path of blended finance, and having blended finance funds and balance sheets that can deal with the risks that are inherent in the markets that we operate in.
Thank you, Marat. Actually, I had a follow-up question as well, because after the first deal, you mentioned that there were many inquiries, right? So what's in your project pipeline, and could you give us a teaser on what's next for you in terms of the transactions?
Yeah, you see, as soon as you are ready, at least in your mind, to move up the risk curve or down the credit rating scale, right? So essentially take that little bit of extra risk and move away from classically bankable or investable into this, what we might call this marginally bankable gray area, the gray middle, you discover that the opportunity set is very large, right? Now, that opportunity set in this part of the world for us consists of situations in the Philippines. Vietnam is continuously interesting. We see opportunities in the EV space, particularly in a place like Thailand, where there are a lot of the early experiments happening that are starting to scale and start to require larger amounts of capital and larger amounts of debt. Debt that perhaps is not really available from the more traditional sources, right? So it needs that extra push before it becomes more mainstream. We are working now on transactions in Vietnam and Indonesia and looking at situations in Thailand and additional deals in Philippines.
Thank you, Marat. So I'll now move on to actually the role of carbon markets. But before that, I'd like to urge everyone to just feel free to ask questions for our panelists. I'm sure everyone would know, right? This could be one of Mikkel's last public speaking engagements in his role as CEO of CIX. So feel free, any burning questions for him or for our panelists, please go ahead and fire away. So, yes. So Mikkel, I think we all know that carbon markets has emerged as a tool, right, to facilitate decarbonization. It's a critical tool. So looking back and, as a founding CEO of CIX, and reflecting on all the different struggles and challenges in the past, right, is carbon markets truly still effective as a tool to enable transition? And, what can we do to scale the markets for Southeast Asia?
Yeah, thank you. No expectations, right, with my last speech or whatever you said, but I give it a go. Look, carbon markets has always played the role of bridging that gap when something is not economically viable on itself. And that will continue to be the case, not as the only solution, but as one component into creating viable solutions that would otherwise only have come to market, technically feasible, economically feasible, years later. And we need those solutions now. So we've seen the carbon credit has solved for that in whether it's a technology space or whether it's a nature-based space. Since we're talking about just transition, maybe the best way to answer your question is in that context. So historically, carbon credit had played a role in taking renewable energy to market. But in isolation, many of these things, at least in many markets, has become viable on its own, and therefore those types of credits really doesn't work anymore. And therefore most people see these only really works as renewable electricity certificates or RECs. But a new types of credit has started to emerge as a potential part of a solution, and that's early decommissioning of coal-fired power plants. So how would that work? The way it would simply work is if you take a coal-fired power plant offline earlier than what it would be economically feasible and put that energy into being generated from renewable energy, obviously there'll be an emission savings, and that can translate into credits. So the calculating that might not be the difficult part of it, but the fact is that that might only happen 5 to 7 years from now, and you need the money up front. So these credits need to come in as a bridge finance together with blended finance to kind of make that work today, and therefore there'll be a lot of forward sales if this starts to take off. I think it's worth saying that these are complex. I always used to tell people that nature-based solutions were more complex than most people think, but this is complex for a different reason. And that reason is we're really solving for a trilemma here, the one that you probably all know about: energy security, sustainability from an environmental point of view and a social point of view, and of course the economic feasibility of this. And if you look at the fleet out here in Asia, depending on which country you look at, some of them are relatively young. And not to have an abrupt transition, but a just one, in some of the grids out here, it's a very large percentage. So the extremes are, for example, in Taiwan, you could do this relatively without large abruption, and the older fleet, so it'd be easier to retire. Look at the other end of this is something like Bangladesh, where it would be quite abrupt if you had to do this. Nevertheless, the question then becomes, at what price would it be viable? And my guess is in some way as good as yours, but you know, some studies suggested it was about the $15 price range, others say 20. But here comes perhaps my key point of what I was about to say here is that doesn't factor in the just transition. It's just a transition, and if we just care about the electricity that gets produced, that probably is about right. But if you actually take care of the just transition and try to factor that in, the price needs to be much higher. And then maybe we can come back to how you get that price and how it compares against other prices in the market if you're interested in hearing about that. And we can also talk a little bit about who could be the buyer group for that, but we can take that in the next question maybe.
Yeah, actually, Mikkel, you took my questions away because I really wanted to deep dive a bit into transition credits and who is going to pay for it. In the previous panels in the afternoon, right, we talked about voluntary market just being $2 billion and people just have this concerns about buying in the voluntary market. You mentioned this price point of $10 to $12, $15, and we know what MBS credits are today. Maybe now also turn to the audience to do a quick poll. At 10 to 15, so imagine you are the Chief Sustainability Officer of your organization, right? If I put out three price points, at what price point would you be willing to pay for a transition credit? I'll start with $10 to $15. Anybody willing to pay? Okay.
A few.
Okay, and actually this is the lowest it will go. It's going to go higher, right? I think if we factor in the just transition cost, it might go up to $20, $30. If we add on the battery firming costs, we need to look at energy storage because we're replacing base load power. That can come up to $40, $50. At the price point of 10 to 15, we only had 3 people in the audience. How is transition credits going to scale? Mikkel, I don't know.
I'll give it a go. So we did actually go out and do some demand sensing from the market. And you're absolutely right. If you price this against some of the other solutions out there that people intuitively compare them to, you wouldn't get to those types of prices. But what people tend to forget is that we shy away from avoidance credits for all the reasons that those of you who know carbon credits kind of knows about the lack of permanence. But once you take a coal-fired power plant offline, it really is offline, I mean, assuming that it doesn't turn back on again. So they are, if you are to play that game, a higher quality of avoidance credits. So I think it's fair to say that it should price higher than some of the normal avoidance credits. But that doesn't get into the realms of $30 where it needs to be. And hence the answer to your question, I think if you were to get those type of prices or even higher, you need a coalition of the willing. You need governments to buy this. It needs to fit into a compliance market. And I say this also because the scale of this. Imagine we magically could decommission all the coal-fired power plants in Asia in a just way. Don't know how you would do that, but let's say you could. The amount of credits that you'd be flooding the market with would be enormous. So to hope that a $2 billion market would absorb that, plus the other credits that are out there that also deserves attention, I think it's impossible. We need to work this into compliance market, and we need to get some key anchor buyers in here to put a high price on this. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to get those prices.
Thank you, Mikkel. I love that in a climate summit, we're talking about cold. So moving on, right, I also like to turn to Cindy because I think Mikkel talked to this point around coalition of the willing. And GenZero and CAPO signed an MOU at COP28 to collaborate to look at transition credit projects. So given that all the challenges that we just talked about, what made CAPO decide to join GenZero on this big, hairy, audacious adventure?
So just like I shared about cross-border renewable interconnection project, it will give you a flavor that we like to take on projects that can be scalable and project that impacts multiple geography, and more importantly, projects that do good to the environment. Another example is really our hydrogen-ready CCGT. If people were to look at combined cycle gas turbine, they will say, hey, it is gas-derived power. But if you look at market specific, for example, in Singapore, the last time a developer reached FID and planned CCGT was more than 10 years ago. So when Keppel started developing CCGT in Singapore, we were determined to find the most advanced, efficient combined cycle gas turbine in the marketplace. And not only that, find one that can be hydrogen ready. So we underwrite the project on the basis that we will run conventional fuel, but meanwhile, we develop the hydrogen supply chain. So this is where it gives us a lot of confidence to have a sense of the levelized cost of electricity vis-a-vis the lower carbon molecule and the pathway. So when it's hydrogen ready, how to bring the hydrogen into Singapore, whether it is via ammonia as a carrier and whatsoever. And with us leaning in, saying that we're going to underwrite the project from the power generation point of view, from the operation and maintenance and asset performance point of view, it gives us relative strength to procure project financing. And in fact, DBS is one of the 3 lenders group in project financing our advanced efficiency hydrogen ready CCGT. And that is one example why if I were to look back, I realized that, hey, we were only calculating this based on the reduction in CO2 emission. So we didn't layer the value of carbon pricing. So it sets me thinking, because my downstream customer wants clean power. So how do I bring and facilitate more clean power in the marketplace where we have influence and control over? So this is where when I had the
lunch with Fred.
with Fred, and we started to explore how to use the Keppel's engineering capability, operating capability, and more importantly, the commercial reach of the timing, the scale, and the type of ecosystem partner we can bring on the table. This will help lend confidence to the ecosystem, and marquee project can then take off. So just to backtrack a bit, how Fred and I got to know each other is also at the back of our green ammonia feasibility study. So we started looking at sources of green ammonia back in late 2021. So we were looking at Australia, and from there on we carried on. We now have a view of levelized costs of ammonia production in North America, in India, in China, in Middle East, in Australia. So this will give us a lot of confidence in terms of the stacking order of, like I said, electricity or molecule is no more price equal, because there is a function of carbon intensity, time and location, and hired for use. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you, Cindy. Actually, I think on this point on project financing and blended financing, I want to turn to Wee Sing as well, because DBS announced last month that you have updated your coal policy to look at managed coal phase out. Can you share some of the thoughts behind that update as well? And also, actually, how do you then measure progress and success? What does success in this whole managed coal phase out projects look like? And actually, how do you even ensure that the bank is truly moving the needle? Because you could be financing the shutdown of one project and something else appears, next door, right? So could you just share some thoughts behind that?
Okay. I think the elephant in the room for Southeast Asia certainly is not the lack of demand for green. If you look at Indonesia, Jawa Bali grid actually is quite well supplied with the last coal-fired power plant that came up. So we were mandated to advise INA. INA is the sovereign wealth fund of Indonesia that was recently set up. And they wanted to shut down or early phase out of coal-fired power plants. So we were happy to do that because I think it was Mikkel who alluded to it. The young fleet of coal-fired power plants in Southeast Asia, 7 to 12 years old, these young fleet is really kind of slowing down that transition, right? So unless we take care of these, because no civil servant in their right mind will want to decom a new plant, right? So we wanted to really work on this, and INA, credit to the Indonesian government, they had that foresight, so we worked with them. So we are close to our first one to be announced soon with ADB. right? So you know how this works, because obviously if I chop off 5 to 7 years of cash flows at the tail end of a power purchase agreement, somebody's got to pay, right? And if you tell the existing shareholders to pay, they probably won't. So there's a combination of concessional capital from the multilaterals like ADB. There are also impact funds who, interestingly, in our conversations with them, actually are still mindful of IRR, but they measure life a different way as well. They measure impact. So when we said XIRR, 5-year shutdown, they said if we lower our IRR, can you shut it down earlier, right? So there are such philanthropic capital out there that's willing to do that. You raised a lot of very valid challenges, because dealing with, obviously, the national utility is not easy, because it's a just transition, what's going to happen, the costing of the replacement, as well as the jobs, etc. Those are things that are still ongoing, but it was someone who said, right, you don't have to be great to start, but you have to start if you want to be great, right? So we thought that this is a very good prototype with the right type of stakeholders, ADB and us and INA. And if we can prototype one, hopefully we can untangle this hairy thing. But the guiding light for us certainly was, if you don't fix this, right, the CO2 that these young coal-fired power plants would churn out for multiple number of years, regardless of how many solar panels you plaster on the earth, it's still difficult unless you start sucking it out through direct air capture, etc. Right? So that was one of the guiding lights. As to how we're going to measure that, we're still thinking through. We're actually working with MAS on this traction on transition credits. So we're aligned with our central bank as well in trying to solve this wicked problem. And I believe they're going to pilot 2 plans to see how we untangle this. But like we say, 70 to 75% of the rightness of it is there. We just got to fix the 25%, and it'll be a waste to kind of undo this just because it starts with it's called COAL, right? So we think we got to take it head on because it's in our neighborhood. And also as to how we're going to measure, you're right, we have come up that our glide path on coal would go down. But I think the sensible thing would be to say on the managed phase out of coal, there would be a different bucket for which, for lack of a better word, is a do-good bucket, right? For which when our exposure to that increases, it's also a measure of how we are propagating and accelerating the phase out of coal-fired power plants. As to ensuring that the coal-fired power plant is really shut down and leakages and all that is things that we're discussing right now as well with ADB, etc.
Got it. Thanks, Wee Sing. Maybe I'll now turn to the questions from the audience. Mikkel, there was a question on, getting you to just deep dive a bit more into the elements of a transition carbon price. So what are these different stacks that you need to talk about, need to add on, and also, is it live right now? Yeah, and how significant will the price be, right, if you add everything up?
Yeah, so what we did is we put out a little paper that talked about the different ways you would price this, and it's relatively straightforward. Of course, you could start philosophically by pricing this next to the social cost of carbon, but then you get a very high price that nobody's willing to pay, $100, $120. Then you can price it based on what it takes to make these economically feasible. Then it's anybody's guess because it really depends on the newness of the fleet. And that's why you ultimately will end up with something which is market driven, which is why I said we got to convince the entire community that this is different from renewable energy credits or even energy transition credits, because then we end at the low ends of the $5, $7, and none of this will really take off unless you get a lot of blended finance from Wee Sing in there and his friends. So I think if you were to, I think the question was also if you were to stable them up on the top of each other, you said some of the elements yourself. There's obviously just the core basics of assuming some kind of blended finance portion. Traction, the group that Wee Sing was talking about, suggested that if you looked at an illustrative example of something like that, and you would end up with a gap of 70 million, you bridge some of that with blended finance, the credits would cost around $14. That's just for the infrastructure, that's for the core. Then you add on the battery cost, as you said, just to create an infrastructure around that. It's a fairly large component. And then the just transition, as I said, I think it's the unknown. And the two pilots that we've been involved with on the periphery, that cost actually mostly surprised on the high side of how much that really cost. So I would say anything less than $30, if you start to table them up, it's not going to be feasible in many places. But let's hope that we can get them down.
Thanks, Mikkel. I think there's another question from the audience around displaced workers. I think this is definitely a key topic around just transition. So I think this question was for renewable energy investors, but I think I'd like to turn to all the panelists, maybe starting with Marat, in terms of, I think, how can players work together to reduce the impact of displaced workers?
Hey, that's the core question in this just transition debate, right? Clearly, which is a very practical question that often when we think about, indeed, very theoretically in terms of financing, capital costs, etc., that question, very practical question, tends to get forgotten, and it certainly shouldn't. Clearly, the importance of making sure that whichever new industries are created and the old, if you will, industries that are being retired, the skill set of the individuals and people who were employed in those industries is transferred. Now that is of course easier said than done. That's a multi-year type of process, which is extremely difficult. So I don't envy the decision makers that have to weigh up the pros and cons of this. That's clearly very challenging.
Yeah, Mikkel, you have something to add?
Well, maybe I can answer the question with a counter question by saying, have any of you in the room ever seen any statement that succinctly describes what just transition really is and when something is good enough? Because I've spoken to a lot of people in the finance industries, in investor industries, and also in corporates. Nobody has a framework for it quite yet ready. So if somebody asks you what is an ultra-critical power plant, we know what it is. If he says, what's your requirement for being carbon neutral, we kind of know about it. But nobody has really even gotten to defining what a just transition is. So how the hell do we measure it or go about trying to solve for it? So it's got to start where it always starts, with some of the financiers trying to say this is what we require, and then obviously it flows from there.
Thank you. Cindy, I mean, given that Keppel has different projects around the world actually, then how do you ensure that these workers' welfare are taken care of?
I think as we accelerate the retirement of coal-fired power plant, like for like, the type of operation and maintenance workforce that's operating in a CFPP is very different type of skill set that you will see in renewable. In fact, renewable, whether solar, wind, has very low O&M workforce requirement. So I'm a big proponent of thermal plant. In this case, it could be bio. For example, we are very big on energy derived from waste. Interestingly, if you look at Asia, we need a long-term, scalable, and sustainable way to treat and manage municipal solid waste beyond just disposing it in the landfill, because there's two bites of the equation. One, you can actually address landfill methane emission, and we know methane is another bad boy that result in even more potent global warming than CO2. Then you have the knock-on impact on water leach out that affects the water quality in developing countries. If we could also pivot such domestic solid waste into energy derived from waste thermal plant, you could imagine a workforce who are operating in CFPP, the type of skill set to operate and maintain WTE facilities, or even bioenergy facilities, or chemical plant. That's why we are also quite big in extending the value chain to look at potentially biofuel. We call it bioenergy. To me, it's a mix, energy mix that is fit for purpose in country as we transit towards lower carbon.
And I think there are multiple technologies across the renewable spectrum, right? So for example, offshore wind, you know that many have looked at offshore wind as a very viable industry to transit our oil and gas workers into, because the subsea structures, etc. That's what Taiwan did. That's what Vietnam is trying to do. I'm sure Singapore, Seatrium, same thing. So it's not just a net loss. I think to the extent you rescale and the new technologies, low carbon solutions coming in, and the sheer scale, like I said, of the intermittency that renewable increases is not a one-for-one replacement of the staff per megawatt, right? So it's
Thanks, Wee Sing. I think we're running against the time right now. Maybe I'll just have the last, quick fire question to all of you. All these things takes multi-decades, multi-generation to take place, right? We need to start them today. And what is the one single most important thing that we need to put in place today to accelerate the transition? Maybe starting with Wee Sing.
No, start with what is the what? Okay.
One thing that we need to put in place today.
If it's for Southeast Asia, I would say the regulatory framework of our neighboring countries. The sophistication or the lack of sophistication or lack of political will to really create that bankable or investable framework they have been there before. It's just that they dialed back. And that would really bring in the investments.
Got it. Political will. Cindy?
If it is at the individual organization level, in fact, example, a next generation team, because to your point, it's not just multi-year, it's actually multi-decade. And we love, this is exactly what we are doing within capital infrastructure. Example, a next generation team from different parts of my existing core vertical. So we pull people from the water business, from the environment business, from the energy business, the engineering team, the commercial development team, and they, maybe in the same age group as which gave me a lot of hope that the young team are willing to rise to the occasion. There's no defined rule book, but there's no defined playbook. But they know they have the organizational backing. They are provided the autonomy to stitch and explore, and that give us honors. Also, we have our 2 feet planted on the ground, but we know, there's meaningful jobs, meaningful relationship that we are developing. So that's at the organizational level. But I think you are right, Wee Sing, other than the regulatory framework, I tend to think in Southeast Asia, key ASEAN member states have to have a reform in some of for example, it's quite common the generation, the transmission, and the retail, and the regulator should be in different bodies so that you don't have the conflict of interest or vested interest. So I think the willingness to do a bit of reform is very important. And hopefully by doing that, we also have a unified carbon market. So give a bit of, should I say, a commonality in terms of how we value and carbon. Because to your earlier question about carbon pricing, I would love to say we should have a common lens towards how to value carbon before we talk about the pricing, because it's very skewed by the different country risk premium in this case.
Thank you. Mikkel?
I was about to say something philosophical and lofty, but given that we luckily ran out of time, I'll just stick to regulation because of my initial thought as well. Cross-border regulation would be quite helpful in this space.
Mara?
Yeah, I'll also suggest something very practical, I think, on top of the regulatory piece and what's already been mentioned. Subsequent to that, or in parallel with that, we need pools of capital that can then deal with the risk that's out there and deal with it in a cost-competitive manner, and that's blended finance. So we need to bring together pools of capital, philanthropic, public on one side, and commercial on the other side, and fuse them together to build these pools of capital that can then go ahead and finance the great work that Cindy will be doing in Keppel and her colleagues and other developers and other sponsors. So that will be my ask today in answer to your question.
Thank you. I think for me, my personal takeaways is I think I took away a few things. One is also around pathfinders. I think this was brought up in the beginning, right? Be brave, be willing to try new things. I think all the different panelists here are all pathfinders in their own fields. I think let's continue to have courage. The other one was around scale, right? So to make things scalable, let's try to club things together, make it into a platform. And finally, I think the last point was also around the people. I think the people aspect of a just transition, I think is also very critical to be mindful of. With that, please join me in welcome and thanking our panelists for their time today. Thank you.